If you search on Google, what does Beowulf's name mean? The AI answer will tell you that it means bee+wolf. Not only that, but it will tell you that most scholars interpret the name Beowulf to mean bee+wolf. Now, the meaning of the name Beowulf, that's a matter of taking evidence that we have, interpreting said evidence, and then using logic to come to conclusions. That's something that people can disagree on. Saying that most scholars interpret the name Beowulf to mean bee+wolf, now that's just wrong. That's just factually incorrect. I recently visited my parents. They have a nice garden and they keep bees as well. And a lot of people have been asking me about the meaning of the name Beowulf and whether or not it might have meant bee+wolf. So I thought this was the perfect time and environment to walk around, make a quick video about what we know about the name, what we can say, who thought what, and what conclusions we can and should come to about this. So enjoy the cloudy Maryland countryside and stay tuned.
I'm not sure how well you can see through the phone camera, but this purple leaf basil plant behind me is swarming with boring bees. They love it. The Old English word for bee was beow, and it's one of those weak nouns, so singular beow, plural beown. And the name Beowulf could have been two constituents to form a sort of poetic kenning, those constituents being beow, meaning bee, and wolf, meaning wolf. So the name might have meant bee+wolf. That is sort of a hunter of bees, a hunter of honey, that is a bear. Now this theory was, as far as I'm aware, first popularized in the 19th century by the philologist Henry Sweet, who was a good scholar. He's mostly known for two pretty high publicity books that he edited and published, that is a grammar and a reader of Old English. But he was also a scholar in his own right, and he thought that the name Beowulf might be one of these sort of poetic kennings. Now, one scholar very invested in this Beowulf, bee+wolf, bear network was Tolkien, who really liked the idea that Beowulf as a character was once a fairy tale character, that the story of Beowulf was once a fairy tale, and that the poet had adopted it and adapted it into a more mature sort of framework, into a more mature story about death and dying and the sort of inevitability of age and decay. Which is exactly what Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings. He adapted a lot of fairy tale elements into a very mature story about death and the inevitability of decay and age in this world. But he was very invested in Beowulf as a fairy tale character, and he thought that the bear son, sort of werebear figure was the perfect sort of pre-Beowulf. Now, there's a lot of reasons why he thought this, and this wasn't just Tolkien, but many scholars identifying that Beowulf has a lot of bearish qualities. He is, for example, described as being very slack as a young boy. The poet tells us that he was not very productive in his youth, and that he wasn't a very promising young man.
Because I think it's important and also just interesting to reference the manuscript, here is the actual passage that I just mentioned. The Beowulf poet has just sung Beowulf's praises for a space, and now goes on to sort of remind the listener, it's possible that the average listener in the 8th century might have already known this, that Beowulf as a child was not considered to be a promising youth. The Jatish princes thought that he slack ware is this half line here. This is 2187b. This letter right here is an abbreviation for the word that. They thought that he slack ware, that he was lazy, that he was slack. And they also called him atheling unfrom. Now, just a reminder, the Beowulf manuscript is in horrible condition. It's really a miracle that we have any of it at all. But the current scholarly consensus is that this word is from, and an atheling unfrom is essentially a not very noble young prince. That is a sort of ironic way of saying that he is sort of messy, lazy, and these are all very bearish qualities.
We're also told when Hrothgar hears that Beowulf is coming, he says that he has heard that Beowulf has 30 månne Minecraft on his moongripe, Haldorov Habbe, that he has the strength of 30 men in the grip of his hand. So he has very strong arms, very strong hands, which is a sort of bearish quality. So that's what Tolkien has in mind when he writes this Sellich spell story, which is what Christopher Tolkien includes at the end of his father's translation and commentary, is that it's a sort of imagining of what the Beowulf fairy tale might have originally looked like if it was about this sort of bear son character, this sort of lazy, slack, slow, sluggish boy, who then, by virtue of his strength, manages to kill the sort of monster that's terrorizing the court, which in the mature version of Beowulf that we have would be Grendel, and win everybody's favor. Now, there's a lot to say about this, almost too much for one video. It's worth mentioning that there's an Old Norse mythological character, Budvar Bjarki, who bears several similarities to Beowulf, but that'll be a whole other video I'll probably make on Beowulf's bearishness, his similarity to that Old Norse character. For now, it's sufficient to say that Beowulf has a lot of bearish qualities, and that's why the name Beowulf was very popular as a theory. Now, the problem with all of this is that if you study Old English names, or just Germanic names, for a while, you'll begin to realize that having Beow as an element in your name, or just any insect in general being the first constituent of a name, is unheard of. One German scholar uses the expression kaum zu denken, unthinkable. And it's true, there just isn't any evidence that they used insects in their names. And if Beowulf did mean bee+wolf, it would be the first name that we have attested in all of the Germanic languages to have an insect as a name element. Now, another idea is that instead of the first element being Beow, bee, it was Beow, barley, or the god name Beow, Beowa. Now that's very plausible. God names were extremely common as first constituents in these Germanic names. Take, for example, Ingeld, the character mentioned in Beowulf and in Widsith, and also the object of Alcuin's ire when he wrote his letter saying, Quid Ingeldus cum Christo. He was talking about Ingeld, but the first element is Ing, which is a Germanic god. In our Scandinavian mythology, we have a character named Bygwir, and that name is cognate with our Old English Beow, Beowulf character. So what this tells us is that there was probably a common character in Old Germanic mythology, and he might have had some sort of agricultural connotation if the name means barley, which might be a semantic coincidence, but in Beowulf, we're told that Beow is the son of Skildshaving, and his name also has some sort of agricultural connotation. And then also when you think in English folk tales, you have characters like John Barleycorn, which is a common thing brought up when discussing this name by several scholars. I think specifically of Tom Shippey, commonly brings up John Barleycorn. Barley, Beow meaning barley, it's just probably not a coincidence. The god probably had some sort of agricultural connotations to his character. So then it's not very strange to think then, if this was an important mythological figure, that you would name your child Beowulf. And indeed, we have Old Icelandic names like Ingolfr, that is Ingwolf, to show that this was a common theophoric naming convention. And if you don't know what theophoric means, let me save you a Google search real quick. It means containing the name of a god.
I want to emphasize that Beowulf's name not meaning Beowulf doesn't really have anything to do with the theory that he was a sort of bearish fairy tale character. They can coexist pretty easily. The problem is that Old English and Germanic legendary characters just don't get named after things that really have to do with themselves. That's not really how it works. I have an example here from the beginning of Beowulf. Here we have two kings named Herugar and Hroðgar. Herugar, his name means something like sword spear, and Hroðgar, which is where we get the name Roger from, also Old Norse Hroar, Hroðgar means something like glory spear. So neither of these names have anything to do with these characters. Hergar isn't known to be carrying like a sword and a spear or anything like that. Hrothgar doesn't carry a spear. He doesn't even really fight at all. He just kind of sits there and gives sort of like wise counsel. He needs Beowulf to fight his battles for him. So if Hrothgar's name has nothing to do with Hrothgar as a character, why should Beowulf's name need to be linked to Beowulf as a character? That is, if we have two competing theories, and one of them is that Beowulf's name has an insect element which never happens, it's a sort of poetic kenning which doesn't really ever happen in real names, the other being that it's a theophoric name, named after a god, which happens all the time, and we have parallels of the exact same construction, it just kind of seems obvious that the latter theory is a better explanation.
So this theory is really championed by R.D. Fulk, as well as Joseph Harris, Leonard Neidorf, Chen Yunju, Andy Orchard. Several scholars have written on it and defended it because at the end of the day, according to our rules of logic, it is probably just true. It's just a much more common, a much more explainable, a much more understandable name. The Beowulf idea is perhaps more exciting. It's exciting and interesting to think that the name of Beowulf might have something to do with the actual character of Beowulf. But as Fulk tells us, what we find is probably actually that Beowulf had a very ordinary name and a very kind of unassuming name, which isn't artful, it's just normal for any sort of legendary character to have a name like that. And it doesn't really tell us anything about him. There's really not much to say about it. So unfortunately, in scholarship, sometimes the correct answer is the boring answer. And I think that this is an instance in which that's the case. Do let me know if you disagree in the comments. If you like content like this, kindly consider checking out the rest of the channel, becoming a subscriber or a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Faratye Yasunde.